Hey everyone, welcome to this first edition here. I am Mr. Cerrato, teacher at Miami Southridge Senior High, and what we're covering here in this lesson is the first of many throughout this year, but these are a series of notes going over the PowerPoints of items of which we'll be discussing in the course of studying United States history. So we begin chapter 1 with the Civil War, and with that said, let us go ahead and begin. Now, first, we have a brief warm-up here in looking at this image. This image, in fact, a painting entitled American Progress, shares a lot with the phenomenon and theory that we call the manifest destiny. And so for the warm-up question that we had here today, what do you believe the giant woman in this image represents? What do you believe this image is about? What details stand out to you? Well, of course, obviously we see the large woman with an almost angelic presence as denoted by the all-white clothing, the flow of her, and obviously her general stature. Now, in her hand, we see a book that reads school book, as well as telegraph wire, as she is bringing it along with her as she makes her movement towards the left of the painting. This is meant as a reflection that she is journeying west, and also behind her is that of American progress. We see the telegraph wires stemming from her hands, the stagecoaches, wagons, not to mention trains and industry that we see to her east. But then looking forward, looking out towards the west, we see the Rocky Mountains, but also we see scores of Native Americans and buffalo fleeing from her presence. What this can be interpreted as is her presence and the American presence now in settling the West, and also the unknown as we see the clouds in the background towards the top of the image, where we see the bright skies of America to the east and also the dark uncertainty represented in the dark clouds of the West. Now, moving into section 1, which is what we will cover today, we are talking about the antebellum United States. So antebellum merely just refers to the time period specifically before the Civil War. Now, what we have to remember about this time period is the idea of sectionalism, that the country is essentially divided into regions, with many people holding their loyalty to their region. Now, defined, sectionalism is loyalty to the interests of one's own region or section of the country rather than the country as a whole. So for many Americans, they had more of their identity with that of their state rather than of the United States. They saw themselves more as a Georgian, a Carolinian, a Floridian, or New Yorker before they considered themselves to be an American. We kind of see this with our thoughts about ourselves, right? Living here in Miami-Dade County. Often, as the phrase goes, 305 till I die. We see ourselves as being Miamian and identify ourselves as such long before we say Floridian or even American citizen. Now, when it comes to those regions, that is then going to affect how we view certain things going on in time. So, for example, when we look at the northern United States, it is largely based on manufacturing goods. It has the factory system. Now, while the north is very populated, it has the largest population during this time, part of that due to being its centers of metropolitan, so areas like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, but also these large metropolitan areas are going to attract immigrants, those coming from Northern Europe, from England, from Ireland, from Germany especially. But these people will then move to the United States to allow for a population. Now, the thing is, due to the industry of the area, it is not one that is necessarily necessary to being conducive to having slaves. You don't need slaves in a factory setting, so that's going to then allow for people who live in the north to be able to put down slavery, that they're going to be able to criticize it because they don't see it as integral to their day-to-day life. We don't need slaves due to the availability of cheap labor, and simply people have the option of being anti-slavery. Is that necessarily going to get rid of racism from the North? No, by no means is the North free of racism. However, it will be free of slavery due to the lack of need for it, and thus people are then willing to be anti-slavery. Now, when we look at the southern part of the United States, which is its industry is agriculture, so you are on the farm, you are on the land. Due to the type of labor that is involved, it is going to necessitate slavery in the eyes of the landowners. So when the cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney, it greatly increases the capacity for the manufacturing of cotton. Now, cotton in its management would then need exponentially more slaves than were already present in the United States. And as such, it is going to necessitate the continuation of slavery and the further importance of slavery within the Southern society. So the way that Southerners feel about it is that they feel like they have to defend it. They have to be the ones to continue the system as they see it as being crucial to making any form of income over the next couple of years. Now, as for the Western United States, and by Western we're talking areas like Missouri, Arkansas, the American Midwest, as the further American West is currently part of Spain and later Mexico during this time period. But in those areas of the Western United States, they were largely unorganized, and unless the people had a need for slavery, it wasn't going to be a thing. So, for example, we look at the Michigan Territory, which stretches from modern-day Michigan to Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota. Slavery is not going to appear in that region simply because there's nothing there that grows that would necessitate slaves. So, essentially, your viewpoint about slavery in regard to you living in the West is dependent on where you are in the West and whether or not you actually hold a position in an industry that would necessitate slaves. Now, as the country begins to grow, we then move to the Missouri Compromise. Following the War of 1812, the United States is at 22 states. 11 are free states, 11 are slaveholding states. Now, in 1819, the state of Missouri is now going to enter the Union, and it will enter the Union as a slave state. This is going to upset the balance. So now there would be 12 slave states and 11 free states. Now, Senator Henry Clay, a monumental figure of the antebellum period, is going to propose the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So either going by the Missouri Compromise or Compromise of 1820. Now, the thing is, Clay realizes that the issue of slavery threatens the integrity of the country, that it could break it apart. So in trying to keep it in line, he suggests the Missouri Compromise in order to keep the balance of things at the time. So the way that this works is that first, the agreement would ban slavery north of the 30th parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri. Now, any state to the south of that would be later added to the United States, would be able to have slavery. Anything to the north of that would not be able to have slavery. But as for the balance created by Missouri entering into the Union, Missouri will enter in as the 12th slave state, whereas Maine would be created out of a portion of Massachusetts to become the 12th free state. So this prevents any issues from coming up within the United States Congress in regards to slavery. One side doesn't have power over the other. Instead, they maintain the status quo of the equal siding between the number of free and slave states at 12 apiece, for now 24 total. Looking here to the map, we can see those southern states. We see the difference, or rather the border known as the Mason-Dixon line, that being the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And then looking at the south, we have Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And then territories like Florida, which had not yet become a state, not until 1827. The Arkansas Territory, along with a portion of Oklahoma, what would become Oklahoma, and of course Missouri. All of these areas are now subjected to allowing slavery. However, those territories in the American Midwest north of that southern border, so what will future become Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Montana, Wyoming, these areas would not have slavery. They are free states. Now, going back to the image that we had at the beginning of class, the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States territory should be from sea to shining sea, that they should be there from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, that it was our destiny to control all this territory, although some would believe that not only should America be from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but from the north all the way through the south, meaning control over what is today Canada, all the way down to the tip of South America, all the way to what is today Argentina. However, on September 12, 1821, Mexico would gain its independence from Spain. Mexican Independence Day is clearly not Cinco de Mayo. That is the anniversary of the Battle of La Puebla. But September 12th, 1821, that is their Independence Day. Now, as far as how Mexican-American interaction began, Mexico, in a quest to try and control the Native American population, recruited Americans and to come and live in the province known as Texas. So the Mexican government would offer cheap land, and in doing so, helping to control the Native American population that was threatening the Mexican government accordingly. Now, so Americans would come to settle in Texas, and pretty soon, though, they would begin to demand their own say in government. They had not been made Mexican citizens. They were not allowed to control the government or have a say in the government, and they increasingly began to make these demands, especially as they had begun to fear the abolishment of slavery by the Mexican government. So you begin to have Americans such as Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin who will begin to clamor for the idea of an independent Texan state, that Texas would become its own country known as the Republic of Texas. Now, this will eventually lead to a revolution and a rebellion, with the first battle of which is pictured there at the Alamo. So the Texans, unfortunately, would lose that battle. We would see some famous casualties, most notably Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. Now, the fall at the Alamo becomes a rallying cry for other Americans to begin to join the Texan cause. So the phrase, "Remember the Alamo," becomes this rallying cry, and soon Texas would establish its independence. And then just a year later, the Republic of Texas will formally join the United States, becoming a state on December 29, 1845. As you might imagine, though, this would then lead to further repercussions with Mexico. Now, before we get to that, I know you must be wondering, why is there a picture of the theme park Six Flags over Texas? What the Six Flags is a reference to, as the amusement park was created in Texas, were the Six Flags that have flown over the state of Texas. Those being France, Spain, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the United States, and ultimately the Confederacy. Now, getting back to our relationship with Mexico. It would be strained largely due to the feeling that Mexico felt that the United States was partially responsible for the independence of Texas, and especially following Texas becoming part of the United States. Now, the new American president, a man by the name of James K. Polk, he was an ardent believer in the manifest destiny. And he saw that a war with Mexico would be the perfect way to capture their territory and expand on American holdings. Now, just as Mexico had invited Americans to come into Texas, they had done the same thing in California. Now, California, they are going to repeat again what Texas had done, declaring their independence, this time known as the California Republic. And soon the United States would become involved in the conflict. Now, the U.S. would win easily thanks to the intervention and leadership of General Zachary Taylor, who will also then later become president. Now, as a result of the battles last for about 2 years, and once this happens, Mexico begins to realize pretty quickly that if the United States isn't stopped here, that they would soon control all of Mexico and expand further. So in order to preserve their own independence and preservation of what is known as, translated wise, the United States of Mexico, they would offer the United States the Gadsden Purchase. They would allow them to, let me rephrase here, but rather the Mexican secession. So what would happen here is that Mexico realizes if they don't stop the war, if they don't stop fighting, the United States is going to take them over. So in that, what they will then do is offer the United States much of the American Southwest, so land that covers California, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, and New Mexico. And then as an added portion, the United States would make the Gadsden Purchase in 1853 in order to add in further territory, especially along a riverbank which provides a natural boundary between the two countries. Now, with the completion of the Gadsden Purchase, that is now how we see here as featured in this image, how we have since expanded from the United States. We are now from sea to shining sea. We stretch from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. However, this new addition of territory is once again going to raise questions regarding slavery and its expansion throughout the entirety of the United States. Now, as Americans move westward, these territories will soon become states as they reach the population threshold, and now the question becomes, what do we do about slavery? Or rather, the continued question that is brought up regarding slavery. So one solution brought up by Lewis Cass, a U.S. Senator, is the idea of popular sovereignty. So the idea behind popular sovereignty is simply that you let the people decide. So when a state comes in and creates its own constitution, let the people vote on whether that constitution has slavery or not. Now, going back to the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of territory, when California becomes eligible for statehood, it is going to lead to an imbalance. That the addition of California as a free state is going to lead to the free states being larger than the amount of slave states. Now, ultimately, in order to get this accomplished, we are then going to need the Compromise of 1850. So, California is going to upset the balance. There will be more free states now, and the South is going to want further concessions in order to allow California and upset that balance. They want guarantees that slavery is going to continue. So, as first part of the Compromise of 1850, it will allow for the question of popular sovereignty to be added in future cases. But perhaps most notably, the Compromise of 1850 is the addition of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, what that required was that slaves would have to be returned back to their owner if they were found in a free area. And if an individual was helping out a former slave, or in this case, an escaped slave, in their escape, and not turning them over, then they would be found guilty of a crime and imprisoned for their action, as the act puts it, taking and possessing stolen property. Now, what that is going to do is further embolden abolitionists, people who are against slavery, into doing things to make sure that the evil institution is put to an end once for all. Now, a couple of other things that are going on during this time period that we should be cognizant of. So, for example, in 1847, we do see the Mormon congregation moving into Utah. We also see, just a year later, after that, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, this would be the first women's rights conference in the United States. They agree that women should be equal in all ways, except for one. They believe that women should not get the right to vote at this time. The reason being was they felt that men would essentially control their wives' votes and essentially make it a second vote for themselves. And then lastly here we see in 1848 and 1849 the California Gold Rush. So gold had been discovered in Northern California, and a small town in particular by the name of San Francisco only had a population of 1,000 people. you had people moving there overnight in order to try and get rich quickly by mining for gold. So that is why we see the aforementioned San Francisco 49ers, why they have gold helmets. It is simply a reflection of the gold rush. So you would have the city of San Francisco, which went from 1,000 to 35,000 in population in just over 2 years. This will also help to settle the West, as we see in other boom towns. So, for example, Las Vegas, and other sites that we see in the West. Getting back to the issue of slavery. So, following the Compromise of 1850, there are going to be those that push for the end of slavery. Northerners are particularly annoyed, especially following the Fugitive Slave Act, and we're going to see a lot more people try and push for the ending of slavery. Now, one of the key events predates the Compromise, and we look to 1831 and Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave who had rebelled against his owner. He had acquired weapons on the plantation and murdered the owner and family, thus freeing himself and all of the other slaves. He would then move on to the next plantation, doing the same, freeing the slaves there, and to another. It is at that point when a militia is called in, and they would put down Nat Turner and would execute him. Now, ultimately, the impact of Nat Turner's rebellion on the South kind of has the opposite feeling as many people think that they would have from slavery regarding this event. Instead of maybe making people feel like they should get rid of slavery, instead it makes many Southerners fear what would happen should African Americans and slaves be freed. They feel that they would then come and attack them, kill them, of the sort, and so they kind of double down even harder that slavery must be kept in order so that they continue to live. Now, in 1852, we see the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the book was extremely popular in the North, and what it does is that it gets a lot of people to be exposed to slavery and the horrors of it. So it makes many Northerners feel that something should be done about the issue, whereas in the South, there was a lot of criticism about the book, saying that it was unfair in its depiction of Southerners and that slavery was not as horrible as depicted in the book. Now, in 1859, we have one major event, that of John Brown's raid. Now, John Brown was a white abolitionist from the North, and he saw inspiration from Nat Turner's rebellion. And so his idea was to launch slave revolts by giving them weapons. Now, his idea was to raid Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which was an arsenal where you could find weapons for the military. He would break into the base, attempting to then steal the weapons. However, he would soon be discovered and, of course, executed. However, now with more Northern abolitionists becoming more boldened in trying to end slavery, that is then going to lead to a further fear of slavery coming to an end via government assistance. Now, in continuation of the conflict that we see the events of Bleeding Kansas. Now, in 1854, we have the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, when Kansas and Nebraska moved to vote for their new state constitution, they would be able to say whether or not they would be a slave state or a free state. Now, one idea that a lot of abolitionists had was that they would actually move to Kansas, uproot their lives, their families, and move to Kansas in order to ensure that Kansas would be a free state. Unfortunately for them, neighboring Missouri, many of their citizens, which with Missouri being a slave state, were pro-slavery, and they did not want to see their neighbor get rid of slavery. So many would cross the border illegally and then vote for a constitution that explicitly allowed slavery. Now, as you might imagine, when the results of the vote came out and people saw that the slavery constitution had won, many abolitionists were angry. Many of the people saw the actions of these Missouri citizens as unlawful, and soon fighting would break out, hence the name Bleeding Kansas. Now, with the fighting growing so severe, the U.S. military would be called in order to make sure that everything is kind of restored down to order. Now, there are more instances of violence here. That the cartoon being depicted here is Senator Charles Schumer of Massachusetts. Now, in a speech, he had basically insulted Senator Butler, saying that he was denouncing him for embracing slavery. How dare he, call himself moral if he is supporting slavery? In the audience of Congress, Senator Butler's son, not son, but his nephew was in the audience. He proceeds to race down and beat Senator Schumer with a cane. So, as we see in this image here, Southern chivalry. The idea here is that they are presenting the South as being almost thuggish in their behavior in defending slavery and not, meeting the expectations of a legislature, of a Congress, in not settling their arguments, but rather trying to beat their opponents up. Now, lastly is one of the most impactful cases in American history, that of the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Now, Dred Scott was a slave, and he was brought by his owner on vacation to Minnesota. So Dred Scott, his wife, and his 2 daughters were brought along by his slave master to a part of the country that had banned slavery. And Dred Scott would argue that he was now entitled to be a free person, that by virtue of him being in a free state, he should now be a free person. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court would not see it that way, and the Supreme Court makes 2 very striking points here. The first point in decision being that Dred Scott had no right to bring the case forward, that not because Dred Scott was a slave, but because he was simply African American, that African Americans were not citizens of the United States, and therefore, because they are not citizens, they don't have rights, including the right to bring lawsuits in federal court. So the case was involving Scott, and having him free was outright thrown out. But the second part was that the Compromise of 1820, which had essentially banned slavery north of the southern border of Missouri, the 30th parallel, that made the Missouri Compromise of 1820 unconstitutional. They also make the striking choice, and very distinct thing, is that slaves are property, and that the government has no ability nor right to take away someone's property and thus hold up slavery. However, what the Dred Scott decision will do is inspire abolitionists that something must be done. Something must be done legally under the law to finally get rid of the peculiar institution once and for all. All right, that is it for Section 1. Next time, we will go to Section 2, where we talk about the direct causes of the Civil War and the buildup up until the Declaration, and of course, attack. All right, so thank you guys for joining me. Hopefully this helps you in your reviews, and we will see you all next time. Take care.